So good evening now. Thank you all for being here and watching all of our presentations and staying until the end to see our hard work this whole semester. So we're the Statues Project, and I'm going to hand it off to Brooke to talk about some project history and context.
Awesome. So our project revolves around probably the most important part of campus, so essentially the UT main mall, which is in front of the tower. So the main mall is the green space in front of the tower. This is considered the entryway to campus, so it's the most recognizable part of campus, and it's what's most associated with UT. Essentially tens of thousands of students, UT students, faculty, staff, and then also tourists know the main mall, walk there every day. Maybe not this semester, but during a normal semester, right? And so essentially the green space of the main mall is surrounded by 6 academic buildings that are colloquially known as the Six Pack. And our project revolves around 6 statues that were removed from the Six Pack in 2015 and 2017. So these Confederate era statues were removed, and some of them were placed in storage. Some of them were placed in museums. And while the statues themselves were removed, the pedestals that they were on are still there, and they're shrink wrapped. And our project essentially ponders like whether or not what can or should be done in this space, because it seemed to us that it was somewhat incomplete, right? For instance, one of our interviewees said that the pedestals seemed like empty holes on campus, that something should be there or something else should be done. And so our project asked what that should be. Can you move to the next slide, please? Yeah, awesome. So essentially, this project is a continuation of a project that started last semester. So we did preliminary stakeholder research and talked to a lot of UT students to see what they wanted to be done with the space. We created a project proposal as a call for artists to do something with the space, which I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide. We met with UT administration to understand what their constraints are, what's feasible from their point of view, and what they want to do with the space. And then we also identified where we needed to research more, which is where we continue this semester. So our existing prototype that we iterated upon this semester was a call for artists, essentially wanted to see our installations in each of the 6 spaces representing the UT's core values. Our entry requirements were kind of broad, essentially like any artist from the state of Texas representing a diverse group, specifically UT students and alumni. And then we also built out some criteria for a selection committee. And I'm going to pass it off, and we're going to talk a little bit more about our research process this semester.
Alrighty, thank you, Brooke. So in order to really gain a sense of the direction we were supposed to be heading in with this project, our team conducted research to really gain insight into the perspectives of the people who have a stake in this project. So we reached out to Black student leaders on campus, including the president of Onyx Honor Society, the Black President's Leadership Council, and the director of Diversity and Inclusion of Delta Gamma, because the underlying sentiments of the statues directly affected the Black community. And to find a solution that helps relieve the feelings of exclusion that these statues represent, we needed to hear directly from a few representatives of the Black community about their experiences. So we also spoke to faculty members and professors because we would be able to gather insight into how we could work alongside administration to create a solution that benefits everybody. And finally, we spoke to a few members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans who also held a major stake due to the statues also representing their history and their heritage. So we spoke to these stakeholders to be able to understand the varying viewpoints on this issue and to see how we can go about creating our solution. And our research process began with collecting secondary research on the stakeholders, as well as examining the current political and social climate of our world to gain a little bit more context. And we then spoke to the stakeholders directly to understand their experiences and viewpoints, while also testing the prototype that was created last semester and gauging the attitudes towards that. And we also wanted to diversify our interviewee base and hear from more people to have a more accurate and holistic understanding of how people are feeling towards this issue. And the major reason why we did all of this was to create a research-informed solution that takes into account the sentiments of all the people involved. And we did this through Zoom interviews and socially distanced in-person testing sessions. And by speaking one-on-one with the stakeholders, we were able to see how each person felt about the issue and how they felt that it should be resolved, which really helped us empathize with each of them and allowed us to see the situation from every perspective, which then in turn helped us get creative with ideating a solution that benefits everybody. So here, I created a visual diagram that synthesized the information that we gathered and the results of the testing from last semester's prototype. So we could see that the members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans that we spoke to wanted to reinstall the statues because it represents their heritage as Texans. And they were also put off by the fact that the university had removed the statues without really consulting them, even though they were also affected by the issue as well. And the UT faculty we talked to were more of a middle ground. They wanted to find a way to keep the statues, but also educate people about the underlying racist sentiments as a way to keep both parties on either end of the spectrum happy. And the Black stakeholders we talked to believed that the prototype was a good start, but we really needed to find a way to clearly educate people about equity and inclusion and not just put up installations as a way to appease the Black community. So essentially, what we were able to see was that there are very conflicting viewpoints on this issue, and we were faced with the question, how can we create a solution that acknowledges the history while simultaneously looking towards the future and helping UT grow into a more safe and inclusive space? So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Shri, who will be defining the problem that we gleaned through our research.
Thanks, Bruhadi. So Bruhadi talked a little bit about how we had varying viewpoints from our stakeholders. And we thought that these three how might we questions really captured the sentiments expressed in our research and research synthesis. So how might we spur UT to be an inclusive campus for all students? How might we create a sense of closure for students affected by the statues? And how might we create and inspire conversations on campus? We really developed these how might we questions to serve as a great foundation for the ideation and prototyping that we'll talk more about later. So with that, I'll hand it off to Vani to discuss design criteria and ideation.
Thanks, Shri. So in response to the how might we questions that Shri just talked about, we created these design criteria. We got to these by pulling quotes and ideas from the interviews and research we conducted that Bruhadi explained earlier. The design criteria we came up with were that our design must first incite conversation. We want these spaces to be constantly relevant to the times we live in and not just something that is eventually walked by and forgotten. The second design criteria is to acknowledge the history of the stakeholders. We researched many different groups of stakeholders, and we want this project to reflect that. Additionally, understanding each of the stakeholders' history will help bring us together as a community. The third design criteria is to prioritize inclusivity. One of UT's core values is learning, caring community, all of us students, helping one another grow. A major goal is to have this project to make everyone feel like they belong to that caring community and that they are part of a nurturing environment. This then led us to the ideation phase. The first part of the ideation phase is rapid ideation. We brainstormed ideas for each of the design criteria we created in the previous phase, as you can see in the mural document on the slide. We then developed those ideas and sent them to our stakeholders to receive feedback. The individual ideas we narrowed it down to were as following. And now some of these ideas may seem like obvious answers. However, some of them go against the design criteria we created. For example, we thought of keeping the original idea that Brooke mentioned in the prototype. And however, we felt that it left many people out of the conversation by not having a diverse selection committee, not prioritizing the stakeholders' history, as well as the idea of building a community. These are all issues that are addressed in our prototype that Chris will now talk about.
Thanks, Vani. First, I apologize my camera's off, but my Wi-Fi has been a little touch and go. But Shri here is going to pull up the prototype for y'all to view. We decided to create a design competition. So what Shri is now showing you is basically an instructional packet for artists to understand what we're looking for in this design competition, which hopefully will have the one day of being put before the Board of Regents and decision makers at the University of Texas in order to be implemented on campus. So Shri will slowly scroll down this document, and I'll point out some of the highlights. First, at the top, we just have a basic introduction of what the competition is, followed by an explanation of the participants, which includes a brief explanation of DFA, as well as Landmarks, which is a public art commission at UT, who we're currently speaking with about a possible partnership on this design competition. Next, we have some submission team requirements, which we'll talk about later, followed by a timeline overview. We feel like this can be accomplished easily within a semester's time, which fits very nicely coming up in the spring. Next, we have the design criteria. We'll go into a little more depth later, as well as the theme, in order to understand for artists what exactly we're looking for in our potential designs. Moving forward, we also have the section on location and importance of the space. This is more about what Brooke talked about earlier, as well as a preliminary budget, description of the judges committee. Obviously, it's important not only to get diverse submissions, but also to have a judges committee that's representative of the stakeholders in this issue. And finally, submission requirements and evaluation criteria. So here you can see some of the things that they'll have to submit, as well as how the submissions themselves will be evaluated. Obviously, that was extremely fast, so that will be published on the DFA website after this presentation and after Expo, if you'd like to view it in full detail. But we'll jump back to the presentation now to talk about a few of those things in further detail. First, we have the theme, which the theme of the design competition is acknowledging and advancing through empowering the voiceless. First, I want to start off by defining and acknowledging a little bit. And it's important that we acknowledge the history of these spaces and these figures and their full complexity in order to understand where we've come from and where we can also advance as a society. And by advancing, we hope to empower the voiceless who have sometimes been slanted in this space on campus. Next, we have the design criteria. I can talk about a little more in depth for you. These should look very similar to what Bonnie just discussed. This is basically the design criteria for a project, but tailored to a design competition open to the public. So it must inspire continuous conversation. And by this, we mean it must be a living design that encourages engagement. Like Bonnie said, we don't want it to be lifeless and dead and something that gets ignored by students as they walk past. And how this is done is up to the artist truly, and it can be achieved through their artistic design or the supporting elements. Next, be made in the spirit of the space. Like Brooke was talking about earlier, this is a very serious intellectual academic space with a lot of foot traffic. So it's gonna have to order and fit that environment, as well as be in accordance with some design restrictions set by the university above. And finally, we have promoting positive and inclusive change. Go along with the theme, we must acknowledge and understand the full history of the spaces and the figures, of course. We also want to make sure that this is a priority moving forward. Next, on the submission teams, this is something we struggled over a little bit. Was deciding between, should this be individualistic or a group effort? And we feel like there's problems and also pros with each and every option here. We understand that if one person creates the artwork for the entire space, this is fundamentally not an inclusive solution because it only represents that person's background. So we want to encourage and show preference to teams who come from different backgrounds and to encourage collaboration on this important issue in our community. And finally, this is obviously a very important space for Texans as well as UT Austin, alumni, students, and faculty, and everybody involved in the UT community. So we'll also be showing a little bit of preference here. Next, jumping to the selection committee. Once again, it's important that we have people from not only different backgrounds, but also all over campus and UT Austin community coming together on a solution here to decide what is best for the community. We still need to flesh out exactly how we're going to be selecting these individuals and what that might look like. But we want to make sure we're grabbing people from all over. And finally, I'll let you read the evaluation criteria really quickly. But basically, this is how we're going to assess how will these submissions fit the design competition that we've created. Basically, it's the intersection of feasibility and implementation, as well as the ability of how well it fits our design criteria. With that being said, I'm going to pass it along to Jackie to talk about a little bit of the feedback we've received so far in this prototype.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. So I'll be hitting some of the main feedback points that all 6 of us have received when talking to our stakeholders on this project. So the first is funding ambiguity, which is mainly about how we will fund the ongoing expenses going into this project and the competition as well. The second is clarity on creators and whether or not they will be in teams or done individually, as well as how many of the vacant spaces will be assigned to each. Expanding the project is thinking about how we will extend to the general UT administration past those on the selection committee already. The 2 types of criteria we find that we must develop is how we will be selecting the selection committee, as well as how we will select the design commissions. And finally, the last 2 are frequency, which deals with whether or not the design competition will be through temporary installments or more concrete ones, and spirit of the space, which Chris has mentioned before. So that is something that we have to define and empathize with ourselves in order to execute this spatial design and nurture inclusivity on campus. Finally, Shri will conclude our presentation.
Thanks, Jackie. You did a great job summarizing the prototype testing that we did. So thank you everybody for listening to all the hard work we did this last semester, and now I'll open it up to any questions.
I can kick it off. I mean, I'm a little biased because I've been tagging along as the mentor with this team all semester, but I just wanted to say that you've done a really great job. And I think that this sort of phase of work this semester has been really exciting to think through, not just sort of identifying it as a potential thing to work on, but really starting to figure out what are the details that are going to be able to kind of engage this into something that will have a lasting impact on campus. And I applaud sort of your constant interest in sort of including as many voices and individuals into both kind of understanding as well as sort of the decision making that goes forward. Regardless of, you know, what happens with the pedestals, I think that the sort of mindset and the practices that y'all are demonstrating are the most powerful part. So well done.
I would like to speak up here if I might. Yes, I'm
Yes.
Martha Hartzog and I'm a historian. And I'm also graduated, I have 2 degrees from the University of Texas. And I worked at UT in the Counseling and Mental Health Center as a technical writer and editor. I'm retired now, so I'm a member of a lot of historical organizations. So I represent yet another stakeholder, and I was honored to be able to meet with Christopher Roper. And at that meeting, I explained, as did my friend who represented the SCV. He was there as a representative of the SCV, but I was there as a historian. Is that right? And we explained to Christopher that it might be interesting if this group also understood what the original design for this monument was, for this installation was at the beginning. The original concept behind this design, first of all, as I noted in the questions there, they were not all Confederate era. There was Woodrow Wilson, there was James Hogg. They were not all Confederate era statues. And the underlying purpose behind this enormous installation for the time was to show that the nation had come back together again after the divisive Civil War and World War I. And the whole concept behind the original installation, and you have that wonderful prow of that ship, that the Littlefield Fountain, you know, that's coming up, the prow of the ship and the mythological creatures was supposed to be going into the future with pride. That was the whole purpose behind the entire installation. So that the underlying principle was that the nation came together. Now, that really ought to be included in any design qualifications or any design criteria. I believe that the people who submit designs for consideration should have an understanding of what the original design was, and if they wish to develop something new out of that, they have then the historical basis. Because as a historian, I do believe that we need to understand history. We need to understand it completely and not just a tiny part of it. And out of that understanding, that complete understanding, that wisdom that comes from understanding, we can develop something more thoughtful, more appropriate to the time if we so wish. So that's my little peroration on this, and I'll be happy to continue to give input on this project. I would want to say one other thing is that the man who was selected designed this material. Everyone knows about the Littlefield house. They know about the Littlefield Fund, then they know about the Littlefield statue. But Littlefield worked with a man named Pompeo Capini, who was actually himself quite diverse. He was from Italy. He was an Italian born and trained classical sculptor. And that's why that fountain that we still see in the front at the foot of the mall looks like something that you would see in Europe, because he was trained there. And actually in this presentation, which I applaud because of its detail and its detailed processes that you're going to go through to choose some designers, your RFP process that you're going to go through. I applaud that, but note needs to be made of how this original monument came to be and the quality of the work that went into it. Thank you.
Thank you for your feedback.
Awesome. Thank you, Ms. Hartzog. Thank you so much for joining us this evening as well. And we truly do appreciate your feedback as well as all the feedback of all stakeholders. I do apologize sometimes if they're referenced as Confederate statues. Sometimes I think that people either, don't have full understanding or just do it out of convenience due to, a handful of those individuals falling under that category. But thank you for sharing with that. Obviously, the history of the figures and the spaces is truly important. And I wish we had more time, than a simple 15-minute presentation in order to talk about the complex nature of those spaces. But we do the best we can with the few minutes that we have. But I appreciate your feedback so much. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions or feedback?
I want to say one more thing. The book that I recently wrote is about women in Texas history. So I think I've seen so many women on this panel this evening, on these various panels, and they're all doing such a wonderful job. And I'm going to say, you go women. I promise that's my final word.
Thank you. All right.
Okay, if there aren't any more questions, then awesome job, everybody. Y'all